already spoke yesterday that the conflicts are not real. When you take them one by one, especially in the light of today's science, we discover that all they have no real reason, they have no foundation. But people imagined in the past, and many people, because of wrong education, because the school programs are not adjusted to the progress of science, till this very day, most of the people imagine and believe that there are severe conflicts between science and Torah. But among them, I think the most popular and the most widely spread, so to say, conflict is Darwinism, Darwinian evolution. And it's a number of reasons probably which can be mentioned why people are so fond, why, I think I mentioned last Friday that many people are in love with this idea that we, God forbid, are descendants of monkeys. The yichus is very, very dear to those people. But as I will indicate in the end of my today's presentation, of course, the real reason is ideological. To many people, it's very important to prove that we, God forbid, as descendants of apes, of monkeys, because that's the foundation of the ideology of permissiveness. When Shulamit Aloni was the minister of education of Israel, Rahman al-Islam, because for centuries education was the most important, the most dear thing in Jewish life. That was something which is safeguarding the Jewish continuity. The most sacred thing was education, and is, and always will be. And suddenly Shulamit Aloni is becoming, is getting appointed as Minister of Education. And one of the things she did in the very beginning of his career as Minister of Education, she took out of the archives all this idea about Darwinism, about monkeys, and she did take care that all the papers would print articles. She revived literally this whole issue, which was partially already forgotten. So we learn from that the real reason is, of course, ideology, permissiveness, because if we are human beings which have been created by God, created in God's image, as the Torah says, and the meaning is, of course, that God has unlimited free will, can do everything. We have limited free will, but when it comes to Torah mitzvahs, so we are not forced, we can make our own choice. So if we acknowledge all that, so one has to be insane to revolt, to go against the Creator. If we convince ourselves that we are not more than monkeys which developed their seichel, their mind, and so on, then of course we ourselves can determine what is good, what is bad. We make our own choice, and we can do everything which we like, but not in the sense of the free choice which God gave us, but literally to go against God, to go according to our desires, to our temptations. Therefore, maybe that's one of the reasons why people are so fond of evolution, but I will mention also another reasons. To many people, it's a kind of a satisfaction, because the Torah says that, specifically Chossid teaches, and it's written in the Tanya, that it's impossible for a human mind to understand creation yesh me'ayin, to understand creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. It's beyond any ability of a human's mind. It's not understood. Now it will never be understood, because the Eibusher knows and creates yesh me'ayin, and as we know from Chassidus, it's not only creation in the beginning, in the 6 days, but every instant, every moment, the Eibusher is renewing the creation, giving new forces, and that's how the world, the physical world, and ourselves, how do we exist. Here, with evolution, people imagine that they are more clever than God himself, because suddenly they have an explanation. Suddenly they can explain how all the living species and plants and human beings came into existence. They have their own explanation. So it's very, very pleasing, those people, that suddenly they can be more clever than God. Of course, it's all nonsense, but taking into account the normal humans' weaknesses, it's quite understandable. Darwinism tries to give a rational explanation to creation. And it is rational. Darwinian ideas are certainly rational. They're certainly even elegant. If you analyze the thought of Darwin, it's a very elegant way of thinking. The problem also is that the theory is absolutely false. The problem is that evolution never happened, as I will try to convince you in the next half an hour or so. Now let's go and recollect what's evolution actually saying. We're not going to develop here the whole theory of evolution and repeat Darwin's books and many, many hundreds of books which have been written on this subject, but just in a nutshell, let's recollect what's Darwinism saying. Darwinism is, first of all, starting with an idea that purely by chance, randomly, spontaneously, life came into existence. And we will come back to this point a little later again. Inorganic matter, because of spontaneous stochastic movements, suddenly got organized into the first cell. It's an incredible, we will see it's impossible, it's absolutely no chances it could ever happen. And if it would happen one time, it doesn't create life. One cell is not giving origin of life, because cells are coming in existence and cells are dying. You need millions and millions of cells to have real continuity of life. But that's how Darwinism explains the beginning of life. And then, beginning from a single cell, a process of development, of spontaneous development of different species begins. And how a new species is created, there are many examples, and maybe the most popular is this neck of giraffes. Why does a giraffe have such a long neck? Why horses don't have, cows don't have such a neck, the giraffe has. And the explanation is, on one hand, elegant, on the other hand, it's quite primitive. The idea is that giraffes are eating leaves from trees, so which giraffe will have more chances to get more food, with a long neck or with a short neck? Of course, with a long neck. Very simple. Now, suppose that there have been animals, a species of animals which with a normal neck, like a horse or cow or others, and it gave birth to a giraffe, the next generation, with a slightly longer neck. This descendants of a short-necked giraffe will have better chances to get food. So, since a fundamental principle of Darwinism is survival of the fittest, natural selection, there is a permanent fight for food, permanent fight for survival. So this giraffe with a little bit longer neck will have better chances to survive. And there are chances that descendants of this giraffe will have either the same long neck or even a slightly longer neck. And so on and so forth. So after many thousands of generations, after millions of years, there will appear a new species which is similar to the contemporary species which we call giraffe. Because of the natural selection, that the positive feature which is transferred by heredity from one generation to another is amplified, is strengthened, enhanced over generation, and that's how a new species comes into existence. The idea is quite elegant, and it makes sense if it could happen in reality. The problem is, the first shock to Darwinism, the book of Darwin was written some roughly 150 years ago. Several decades later, genetics was developed. And then suddenly people realized that that's a very difficult point for Darwinism, because heredity, turns out, is a very, very strong force, and genes are very, very stubborn, and how then can we assume that those random changes are happening, that suddenly a certain species is getting abnormal good qualities, good features which help to survive. But somehow it was settled, the conflict was settled down mainly by Huxley and others, and that's how, instead of classical Darwinism, what's called modern synthesis came into existence, which synthesized genetics with classical Darwinian evolution. Then, over the next 50 years, or more than 50 years, a new problem arose. A new problem arose that they couldn't find the missing links. I mentioned already briefly this on Friday when we just started, that with tremendous effort put into digging and trying to find fossils which would represent the links between one species to another, if there have been thousands or millions of generations with slightly better qualities of this organism, then it should be not that we find relics, fossils of one species, and then suddenly of another species. But we should find all the intermediate stages, millions of examples, which we can put in one chain and see how it developed over very, very many generations. But in reality, it turns out that among all the fossils, and especially it was obvious when they tried to prove the chain of development from an ape to a human being, they desperately wanted to have something which would be intermediate. But always what they found, either after careful analysis by zoologists and biologists and physiologists, it turned out that either it belongs to an ape or to a human being, and nothing in between. I mentioned already that regarding something in between reptiles and birds, they have been very proud. They found what they called archaeopteryx, half bird, half reptiles. And they put it in the British Museum of Natural History. That was one of the most valuable things they ever had in this museum. But some 15 years ago, a group of scientists headed by Fred Hoyle, there is a very famous British scientist, astrophysicist, and he's also specializing in many other fields, Fred Hoyle, and he organized a group of scientists, one Israeli, also Lee Spetner. I happen to know him quite close. He works in Rehovot. Went to this British museum, and a little bit illegally they got access to this Archaeopteryx and made an analysis, and it turned out that it's an absolute fake. A German sold this fossil, supposedly fossil, but it turned out that it's man-made, it's absolute fake, it's fictitious, it had never anything in common with a real animal which ever lived. Otherwise, there are no missing links. That's a very, very serious difficulty, and we will come back to this in a few moments. In the meantime, I want to talk a little bit about the necessity to put Darwinian record into order. We need to know the age of fossils, to what time they belong, when this animal from which we got out of the earth, a fossil, when did the animal live? And that can be done by all kinds of clocks, and we will speak more about all kinds of astronomical and geological clocks and carbon clocks tomorrow when we will speak about the age of universe. But in principle, how is it done? It's done by what's called in mathematics extrapolation. What's extrapolation? When you extend a certain function, a certain curve beyond the region in which you have actual measurements. So let me illustrate it by a very, very primitive, simple example. If, for instance, we would like to know more about rabbits. How do rabbits grow? Rabbits are growing very fast. After a rabbit is growing, just in few days, in few weeks, it's increasing its weight and size very dramatically, very fast. So suppose that we have been given a task to establish how did a rabbit grow. And we will take a small one-day-old rabbit and weigh it and find, say, well, again, what's here, pounds or kilos? What do you use? Kilos. Oh, that's good. So suppose it weighs a quarter of a kilo first day. Then we weigh it next day, and of course I'm exaggerating, it doesn't go so fast, but next day it's already half a kilo, and next day it's 3/4 of a kilo, and so on. And then we decide why to go on. We already see it. The rabbit is gaining every day 250 grams, a quarter of a kilo. And we make an extrapolation. What will happen in 100 days? In 100 days, the rabbit has to weigh 25 kilograms. What will happen in 1,000 days? In 3 years, it has to weigh 250 kilograms. So it's getting greater than a cow and a horse and many other animals. That's nonsense of extrapolation into the unknown. We have the right to make a slight extrapolation. If we have a curve, we can extend it a tiny little bit because usually most of the curves are smooth, although not ever. There are curves which are jumping up and down dramatically and non-continuous functions in mathematics, all that is known. But for purposes when we have no other choice, we could extend a tiny little bit and believe it's true. But to make an extrapolation, say if we weigh the rabbit 4 days and then we extrapolate for 100 days, that's already illegitimate. What do they do with fossils in establishing the age? We observe today modern science altogether exists, really modern science exists less than 100 years. Classical sciences exist 300 years. But it's still nothing and zero and nil in comparison with millions of years which they supposedly established through all kinds of clocks, and as I told, we'll speak more in detail tomorrow. So we take an extrapolation from a known which lasted in the best case 100, 200 years and extend it over millions and billions of years. You can get everything you want. Sometimes extrapolation is legitimate. For instance, in meteorology, in weather forecast. It developed quite dramatically over the last decade or so, and now with the advent of a new theory, chaos theory, which we didn't speak yet, we will speak a little bit in the few next lectures I will be giving. It's improved, but still in many cases meteorologists have to go by extrapolation. If they observe the weather yesterday and the day before yesterday, and exactly a year ago, the same date, so they can extend a little bit the curves for temperature, pressures, rainfall into the future. And that, as I'm getting here, very, very justified remarks, that not necessarily helps, because even here, my little experience in Australia, when I came Friday, I think they predicted that Shabbos, it will be raining in the morning, but then it will clear up. And it was raining the whole Shabbos, and it was not so pleasant at all. But we cannot blame the meteorologists, because that's the kind of field they are working. And there is no precise solution, so they go by extrapolation, by necessity. But the advantage of the meteorologist is that they do extrapolations forward. And then we know for sure that Mirza Hashem tomorrow, in 2 days, in 3 days, and the extrapolation is less reliable the longer the period is. If they make a prediction, a weather prediction for a whole season, for a whole winter, say, or a whole summer, it's usually very, very far from reality. If they do a forecast for a day, so sometimes they do find the real answer and sometimes not. But at least in a day, 3, 4, in a week, in a month, we will know whether they have been right or not. if the geologists or paleontologists or those who deal with evolution are doing extrapolation backwards, there is no way to check it, because only in movies people are traveling over time in the past and in the future. In reality, we have not the slightest chance to do it. Therefore, we will never know. It always will remain pure speculation. That's another fundamental difficulty. Now, mutations. One of the absolutely necessary ingredients of this process of development is that species, despite heredity, would vary, would manifest some changes from generation to generation. And it's supposed that there are positive mutations, that the changes of heredity in some instances are giving to the animal positive features which help to this animal to survive. Experiments have been done for years and years in trying to get in the laboratory a positive mutation. And they used usually all kinds of insects, all kinds of small flies, which multiply very, very fast. In just a few weeks, you can observe hundreds, if not thousands, of generations. And they used very strong influences, like very high pressures and all kinds of chemicals, and also radioactivity. They got mutations, they got changes in heredity, but all the changes have been fatal. All the insects died and couldn't survive. Never a positive mutation with a positive new feature was observed, and that the animal or the insect would survive. So that's another difficulty which people who believe in evolution and promote evolution tend to forget or not to mention. Of course, the greatest problem is, how did it all start? Because for a cell, a simple cell, to come into existence, you need, first of all, protein, those huge molecules of protein, which is a foundation of every living organism. But proteins without any other features are not enough for continuity of life. Life needs to be reproduced. And to be reproduced, it needs heredity, and it needs DNA, because that's what gives over from generation to generation the features. And to assume that in one spot, spontaneously, by chance, proteins have been generated, and DNA was generated, and it all came together and made a cell. Calculations have been made, and the probability is 1 divided by a number with 40, 50, 60, 70 zeros. There is no name to such a number, and no number of years would suffice that this would happen once. It's absolutely improbable. Forget about the necessity of millions and millions of cells to start life. So that's another difficulty, and nobody has any answer to this question. Then there are more technical problems. There are many kinds of animals which you cannot explain through evolution. One of them is electrical fishes. You probably heard there are fishes, specifically eels, and not a very non-kosher fish, but for the purpose of our analysis, it doesn't matter whether it's kosher or not. We're not going to eat it. So electrical eels are protecting themselves by creating an electrical discharge of about 200, 300 volts. Tremendous electrical discharge, which is able to kill or at least frighten even very big fishes and sharks and so on. How did it come into existence? According to the principle of Darwinian evolution, it should be in the beginning a normal, non-electrical fish. And then suddenly it should acquire this property, this ability to develop an electrical discharge. How can it happen? The apparatus, the device which creates this electrical discharge, is enormously sophisticated. There is no more sophistication than in a contemporary power station, even nuclear power station. Why? Because a power station is huge, big. It occupies many, many acres of land. While this mechanism in the eel is occupying maybe less than 1 cubic centimeter, and it has all this ability to control the electrical charge, to generate it, to convert mechanical energy into electricity, chemical energy. Tiny, tiny power station built into the eel. Well, only the Eberster, only Hashem can create such a thing. Probably mankind, even in 100,000 years of additional development, will be unable to do it. But how did it come into existence according to Darwinism? They cannot assume that suddenly a normal, non-electrical fish gave birth to an electrical fish. Because to assume that, just by chance, by some variation, by some mutation, to assume that would be the same as to assume that a carpenter who is building all kinds of wagons driven by horses, a carriage for horses, by mistake, he suddenly built an automobile with fuel, with a motor, and so on. Can you imagine that just by mistake, by chance, he built an automobile suddenly without knowing even what an automobile is? That's impossible. So what we can assume that a fish was born, came into existence with an ability to create maybe a 1/1000th of a volt electrical energy. That's also not so easy to assume, but that's easier acceptable than the idea of a fully developed power station. But 1/1000th, 1 microvolt is absolutely useless. It's not a positive feature, because with 1 microvolt you cannot kill even a bacteria. Forget about any fish. A normal fish would not feel even such a voltage, 1 microvolt. So how can we assume that this new feature will be, since it's positive, it will help the fish to survive, and the next generation will be with even a little greater apparatus to create electrical discharge and so on. So it doesn't work. Evolution doesn't give any possibility to answer such questions. The same goes, for instance, for snakes, poisonous snakes. Again, the same idea. A poisonous snake has a tiny, very, very tiny, but a real factory, industry to create poison. How did it come to existence? If the amount of poison, of strength of poisons was minimal in the beginning, it was useless. It was absolutely not helping to the snake to survive. That's another difficulty which nobody takes into account. Now, with missing links, of course, that still is remaining the main issue. And back in 1981, there was a World Congress of Evolutionists held in Chicago, where they announced officially, about 3,000 professors of evolution came together in Chicago in 1981, and they announced officially that they are in a dead end. There is no way to go because it's absolutely necessary to find missing links, and all the efforts gave nothing. And then a salvation came from Stephen Gould. There is an evolutionist, a biologist, Stephen Gould, working mainly in Boston, in Massachusetts, the United States, who came up with a splendid idea. Of course, I'm simplifying. Don't criticize me that I'm voting incorrectly. He puts it in a very scientific envelope. He presents it in a nice scientific wording. But if we go down to the essence of what he's saying, it would sound like the following. He says, we all know that evolution is an existing fact. How do we know? We live with the idea of evolution already for several generations. And every small boy in the street knows that there is a thing called evolution. So it must be true, it must exist. Now, it doesn't go together with the fact that there are no missing links. We couldn't find missing links. So what's the way out? Why there are no missing links? So the next step he makes is maybe Darwin was wrong. Evolution, of course, is true and is right. But his explanation wasn't true, because his idea was of a gradual change over thousands and millions of generations, very slowly, millions of years, and then you have to find fossils in the earth. But we don't find fossils. So Darwin should be wrong, and maybe, since evolution is right, maybe the transition was not over millions of years. Maybe it was overnight. Or at least in the paleontological scale of time, it was sudden. One species was transformed, converted into another species. Then, of course, there wouldn't be those connecting links in the earth, because it happened suddenly. Nothing was remaining in the earth. Now, reasonable people say, okay, but why did it happen? Darwin knew how to explain the changes. How do you explain? Stephen Gould answers, of course, we don't know, but that's what we are going now to research. So look at how nice it is. Evolution is preserved despite the evidence, which is ideologically very important, especially for atheists. And all those who are working in evolution, those thousands and thousands of people who are getting governmental and other budgets for their work and writing books and supervising PhD students and getting grants and so on, they can continue and even intensify, because now we have to start from the very beginning. We have to reinvent Darwinism, which will be called Gouldonism or whatever it will be called. Well, that's the situation, actually. So we live in the era of post-Darwinism. There is no more Darwinism because it doesn't fit, it doesn't correspond to the findings among the fossils. It's something of Gould and other. He has many colleagues who work with him and who support him. That's the situation. That's the situation as it is now. I have to make a number of following remarks. First of all, it's very strange how people are accepting in one situation what they reject categorically in another situation. You know, Darwinism is no more than an imagination, a hopeless attempt to reconstruct the past. Past where we have no access. And compare it, for instance, with a court. Suppose a criminal deed happened, somebody, God forbid, was murdered, and the police starts investigation. Nobody would be satisfied with the degree of evidence equal to the degree of evidence for evolution. Because, you know, you can find all kinds of artifacts, you can find all, the investigators can make all kinds of theories. How did this murder happen? And actually, that is the foundation of all the books in this area and movies. When despite all the evidence, the superficial evidence, it turns out that the murder is something else, and otherwise there wouldn't be a story. And usually, the supposed murderer can be sentenced only after witnesses are found who can give real testimony that they saw, they have been present, or he himself is confessing that he did the crime. So here we are very rigid. We demand firm evidence, confession, live witnesses, and it's how it should be. When it comes to evolution, everything is forgiven. There's no evidence, there's nothing, there's just speculation, and we believe in it. So why such difference in criteria? I don't have an answer, except that when it's good for ideology, so everything goes, because ideology means a party, means a certain influence on people, politics, and so on and so forth. There is one more reason why Darwinism cannot work. We spoke yesterday about quantum physics. And quantum physics is a theory which is unanimously accepted. There is, I don't know anybody who is a real scientist, a real physicist, who would have an idea of rejecting today quantum physics. Maybe it will be, if new evidence will be obtained, maybe in another 10 or 100 years, quantum physics will be rejected. But today, by the way, somehow I met quite a number of people who are a little bit crazy on rejecting, on refuting Einstein's relativity. They try and try, you know, there are also many people, inventors, who suppose they are inventors, who are trying to invent the perpetual motion. But the French Academy of Sciences already 150 years ago announced that they will not consider more projects based on perpetual motion because it's known that it's impossible from the point of view of any physics, classical physics and modern physics. But today, quantum physics is generally accepted. You cannot move without quantum physics. And quantum physics, in its Copenhagen interpretation that we spoke yesterday, is saying that what is not directly observed by a human being possessing free will actually does not exist from the scientific point of view. It doesn't possess real existence. What Darwinism is trying to do is to deal with objects which don't have real existence because they haven't been, by definition, they haven't been observed by a human being. By the same Darwinistic theory, man didn't exist then when those animals lived. Hence, we even scientifically cannot say that the object of Darwinistic investigation existed. They didn't possess existence from the point of view of modern physics. Therefore, it's an absolute contradiction and mistake, and it's wrong fundamentally, methodologically, philosophically, to speak about Darwinism. And beyond anything else, I have to make a very radical statement. Darwinism is practically simply useless. After all, sciences, which is a very expensive field of activity, sciences are justified by their practical results. If a science is leading to better quality of life of people, it's certainly justified and useful and wonderful. Darwinism did not make any discovery, any development, anything which is for the sake of mankind. Just because of curiosity, or rather supporting ideology, it's really too expensive to pay those enormous amounts of money which this false investigation is demanding. The Rebbe is explaining why people are so gladly accepting evolution, beyond all those reasons which we spoke. The Rebbe says that in this instance, a terrible mistake is done. People tend to apply to God human qualities. Because if you would be given a task to create the entire universe with all the stars and galaxies and plants and animals and human beings, and you would be given two choices, two possibilities. One is to sit down and create every creature separately, every species separately, every plant separately. And the second would be that you would set the laws of nature and let everything develop spontaneously itself. Of course, as a human being, you would say, nonsense. Thousands of lives wouldn't suffice to create all those creatures. It's impossible. The task is much beyond my abilities. I'm scared to think about it. And therefore, they apply the same logic to God. They believe that it's too difficult to create billions and billions of creatures. But they forget that by definition, there is no such idea, not such a concept that it's difficult. For us, many things are difficult. For the Rebbe, there is no difficult. By definition, he has nothing to do with the concept of something being difficult. And that is, of course, a fundamental mistake from the Jewish point of view. In general, sometimes we don't pay attention that we force the Creator to act according to laws of nature. We discuss miracles, and maybe we will in one of the next lectures, and other things. And we tend always to apply to him our limitations, which is, of course, nonsense. He established laws of nature. Therefore, he is the one who is certainly not obliged to. It's true, the Torah says that in most cases, we see that in normal circumstances, life is going according to stable and non-changed laws of nature. But we also know that in Jewish history, there have been, and there are now, and we expect the greatest miracles, the revelation of Mashiach. This is beyond nature. And of course, God is not limited by laws which he himself established. And to conclude, and now today I really want to leave time for questions, just one story that didn't happen to me. I don't know if Professor Velvel Green ever was here and gave a lecture. So maybe he told the same story, because that happened to him, about green dinosaurs. Well, first of all, strangely, many people, and especially youngsters, are very much in love with dinosaurs. I don't know why. I was personally shocked when I just came to Israel, and I was shocked by the low level of Jewish education in most schools of Israel. With a number of friends and colleagues, we made a statistical survey to find out what do the students know in higher grades of high schools. And we made a questionnaire, and we checked their knowledge in Jewish history, and knowledge in Yiddishkeit, in Torah, and knowledge in all kinds of external things, all kinds of nonsense. So sadly, we discovered that on the question, who was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, only a small fraction, less than 5% of the students knew what to answer, more or less, not necessarily precisely, but at least something. And lehavdil, thousands and thousands of havdolas, in the other part of the questionnaire, we wanted it, we deliberately put such a question, what is a dinosaur? And on this, every student, more than 90%, could write a whole page or 2 pages what the dinosaurs are, which was very sad. So Professor Green tells the following story. He once visited the same Museum of Natural History in London, which I mentioned in a different connection to the Archaeopteryx. And as every museum of nature, this museum has a huge model of a dinosaur. And my dear friend Velvel was walking around and looking on this huge creature, and suddenly a strange idea struck his mind. Why is a dinosaur painted green-gray color? After all, they found bones. They didn't find the meat. They didn't find skin of the dinosaur. They only found bones. So why it's green? And he is a man who knows how to persist if he comes to an idea. He went to the principal of the museum, and he asked him the same question. Why is your dinosaur green? The principal was very angry, kept silent for a minute, and then Velvel Green got such an outburst of anger. Mister, where from did you come? Visit any museum of natural history in the world, they are always green. So that's the logic. They found some bones, huge bones. They invited an artist and sculptor to reconstruct the creature in their imagination, and they decided that the creature ate probably grasses and leaves. It should be green. And then, of course, it was multiplied in all kinds of journals and books and color television, and that's how they became green. That's a level of understanding and a level of seriousness in regards of all those questions. Okay, let me cut myself short at this point. I will stop myself at this point, and now I am ready for your questions. Yes?
2 points. Yesterday, you were talking about quantum physics. You said that each object is only exists unless we're observing it. This is a scientific fact, correct?
Yes.
So what about the first 5 days of creation? Didn't that exist, even though there was no man yet?
No, you should mention that I told what you quoted, but you didn't quote my immediate reservation, which I added, that it's only valid if you don't take in consideration the most fundamental fact, the existence of the Creator. Because if he says he created the world, and we read about the creation of the moon in the very beginning of the Torah in Parsha Bereshis, and that's why the moon, of course, exists. But scientifically, if we don't take in consideration the creation and that God not only creates but sustains every object, then scientifically, if there wouldn't be an observer, we could say absolutely nothing, and including we couldn't say whether this object exists or not.
Okay, good. And one more quick point. Okay, now it seems to me that the scientists want it both ways. On the one hand, they want to say that mankind's center of the universe is nothing greater than our mind, is nothing greater than our perceptions of the universe. On the other hand, they want to say that we're just animals. They can't have it both ways.
Well, they can. An animal can be quite sophisticated and clever, you know. There are in all kinds of scientific fiction books and movies, there are all kinds of creatures which are beasts, but what we cannot be moral, as Torah demands, moral human beings and animals. That's impossible. But to combine some sophistication and abilities, physical abilities, well, they imagine it's possible. But after all, that's what actually the bottom line of my talks, that they are absolutely not logical. They put together things which cannot be put together. Any other questions? Yes.
17 years ago, in Victoria, we had an ash it's like a fire in one region. And there was a butterfly mold, which usually was a light color. But there was a diversity in them, some of them darker, some of them white. And in a 2 years' time, this species became almost black because of survival of the species, and this example was presented as a support for Darwinism.
Well, the fact is certainly possible, because also in experiments, in deliberate experiments, when they used all kinds of artificial influences to check the possibility of mutations of heredity, in butterflies they often are getting change of the color. For instance, a butterfly which usually is known as a white butterfly or light colored butterfly is becoming black or dark. But that doesn't mean a new species. That's the whole difference. Those new butterflies are the same species but with a different color. The same as there are all kinds of birds. When you have white version and black version, and there are several criteria what constitutes a species, and those can breed together. There's no limits, no borders between the species. That means that it's one species which just change the color. That's a known fact. Other questions? Yes?
I would like to ask a question regarding the previous lectures. You said that science goes from paradigm or theory to paradigm and so on, and never gives us absolute truth. Now, I feel that the written word of the Torah can't give us truth either, because the Torah is written in words, and words are symbols which equal thoughts, and thoughts are energy, obviously created by God, which are then interpreted by us humans as what we interpret the written words in by what we either already know or we interpret it by according to our education, our culture, and so on. So I feel that the only way to really get enlightenment or feel a oneness with God can be by meditation, spiritual practices, or prayer. I wonder if you could comment on that one.
Well, spiritual practices and prayer, all that is absolutely legitimate in Judaism. There's no argument, no question about it. Now, that there can be different interpretations, different views, it's also a fact, and actually the whole Talmud, the whole Gemara is discussions and disputes, but for that purpose we have great scholars, we have Chazal, we have great Jews all over the Jewish history, we have great tzaddikim on whom we rely. That it's I think one of the fundamental principles are that we have to accept that for an ordinary Jew, not a tzaddik, it's very important to rely on the tzaddik, on the great Torah scholar, on the righteous man who gives the correct and applicable interpretation, which is the best one out of many possible. Well, that's it in a nutshell. That's how I feel and how I perceive it. But maybe it's a too rabbinical question, and you have here not only scientists like me, but you have among the lecturers distinguished rabbis. Maybe you ask better them. Now let's accept the question from the ladies again. What?
The Earth does not move.
Well, we spoke
Doesn't
about it.
rotate.
Yeah.
So how would you explain to children day and night and the seasons?
Well, because the movement of the sun. The result is the same in both cases, of course. Yes.
My question relates to that because
A little louder, please.
I read in a book that the word eretz can be understood to come from the shorish ras, which means run. And that author who wrote that book said, well, that shows that that there's an intrinsic understanding that the earth moves. So
Well, I think I better would not comment on that. I don't know the book. I don't know the author. I disagree with him. That's all I can say. Yes.
Perhaps an explanation for the animals that they find, the fossils that they find that are no longer existing, that some of these might not be amongst the animals that were extinct and that came up later. Because we know there were only
Well,
kids that were allowed to come on.
first of all, I have to make a very clear statement that I'm not trying to refute that fossils exist. There are fossils which are certainly bones of shape and size, which is not fitting any of the existing species of animals. So you can assume many things. We can assume that those are animals from before the Mabel. There could be even the more radical idea that, because in some commentaries it says that God created worlds and destroyed worlds. So our world is not the first one, so maybe those animals are relics from the previous worlds. All that is legitimate. What's illegitimate is to try to use it for developing the idea of evolution and spontaneous generation of species and so on. Nobody can reject or refute the existence of fossils, of course. Let's take from men now. Yes.
Professor Richard Dawkins is one of the exponents of Darwinian theory. You may know him.
I know. I don't have any personal relationship with him, but I listened to his lectures several times. I saw him in Jerusalem, in England.
What he says is arguably, fraudulently, is that a piping pool of monkeys, given enough time, could come up with the works of Shakespeare. Now, that is obviously deeply flawed. And if you want to answer it, I can. If you want me to answer it, I can.
Well, I spoke for an hour now. Let's give you an opportunity.
Well, it's fraud. It's absolutely fraud. For a start, a given monkey with a typewriter. Presumably, you have 1 million monkeys with 1 million typewriters. It's equally fraudulent. For a start, he has 1 in 26 chance of getting the first letter right, and 1 in 700 chance of getting the first 2 letters right. But it resets to 0. You cannot accumulate with guesses. So, if Darwinism is predicated on this group of monkeys scenario, it is nothing more than a group of monkeys getting together to think about it. But it's absolute fraud. It just cannot happen.
I fully agree with you. Thank you very much. I think you in the red shirt.
The contradictions between science and Torah are quite clear, and I agree with you on many different points. Can you put forward any reasons as to why the media or why the general scientific community are blinded to those contradictions? I mean, just
Well, partially I spoke about it already, mentioned several times. There are ideological reasons. There are some people who are honest, not really having any direct ideological benefits in their mind, but just going by routine, by their education, you know. Education imprints in psychology of a person, which have been done in early childhood, are very strong and are dominating the life of the person. But there is one observation over the last last 10 or 20 years, that especially in our time, the more a person knows about science and the more serious scientist he is, the easier he accepts the ideas about Torah, about spiritual values. And I had it several times. For instance, I once gave a lecture about Torah and science in Los Alamos laboratories, the laboratory where they produced the atomic bomb in the Second World War in the United States. And after my presentation, there was a dispute. People argued with me first, and then one lady and one man started arguing between themselves, and I could sit down and just observe them. And the lady was violently rejecting everything what I was saying, and the man was saying the opposite, that he agrees with most things and he thinks that it makes sense. I was curious, and I asked some of the local people, who are those two? And I got the answer that he is one of the most famous and prominent physicists of the laboratory. Well, she is, and maybe there are secretaries here in this audience. I don't want to say anything not nice about secretaries, but she was altogether a secretary there. And she maybe, in the best case, she was sometimes typing an article, but certainly not writing an article. And she was knowing absolutely 100% that I am wrong, and that all those arguments I brought are not making sense, while he was gladly accepting it. That's repeating itself always. And you know, for instance, in Russia now, Russia was such a fortress of atheism. Most of the scientists, because they got a shock, they got a cultural shock from things which happened in Russia. Nowadays, most of them gladly accept the existence of the Creator and the necessity to not only rely on observable facts, but also on the spiritual teaching. And that's in a nutshell. Maybe one more question from the ladies, and we have to finish. Yes? I hardly can hear you. I can't hear. Oh, the question is about sunspots, the black marks on the sun, right? Well, sunspots is a very easily explainable physical phenomena. It's a big vortex. They usually appear in pairs. So this vortex is bent, and the ends are on the surface. And that's an area with very fast rotational motion and with a very strong magnetic field. And they appear to be darker than the surroundings. That has nothing to do with any mysteries. I don't know. Where is Chaim Tzvi? We have to finish, I guess, no? One more? Yes. Well, that's whether the 24 hours of the days of creation haven't been our 24 hours, but something completely different, that it could be a whole era and so on, right? There have been, of course, this suggestion, and even by some great Torah scholars of the previous century. But as I mentioned before, then it seems that sciences are presenting absolute truth, and that a real conflict and problem, and for young people they had to find a solution, and some manifested a slight tendency to compromise. But as the Rebbe is saying, there is absolutely no possibility and no need from the point of view of truth to accept such ideas, because everything in science is now supporting the possibility of the literal understanding, of the literal meaning of the pshat of the Chumash. And regarding this, the Rebbe is bringing a very important halachic reason why we cannot accept it as eras, as long periods of many, many years, because some Jewish documents are valid only if the date is correct, and specifically if Chalila a get is written. So there are several conditions that you need a scribe, you need a sofer, and you need all kinds of other conditions. And at the end it's written that the get is done this and this day and year from creation. And if that is not correct, so the woman is not divorced, and it could lead Halila to mamzerim and so on and so forth. So if we try to compromise, it has also halachic implications, and therefore the pshat, the simple meaning, is absolutely binding and necessary. Thank you very much. I think we have to continue tomorrow.